Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Of the three roots of all suffering, desire, ill will, and delusion or ignorance, it's the third one, delusion or ignorance, that is really at the root of everything else. Avidya is ignorance, not knowing. And as one of the roots, it's called moha, which is more like delusion. There is kind of a subtle nuance here that ignorance is not knowing and delusion is knowing wrongly or being confused. The forms that delusion takes can be many varied kinds. But it's mostly the webs that we spin in our mind ourselves. When we fall into the error or the confusion, for example, of what's philosophically is called naive realism, that's one form of delusion. It's very common just to assume that what you see, hear, touch, and taste is just as it is real and substantial. The Buddha, in his teachings, he didn't get into metaphysics or make ontological definitive statements unless there was a practical reason to do so in order to fulfill the purpose or the goal of the teaching, which is to transcend suffering. So when he spoke about the human organism, one of the preferred methods or models that he used was the five khandha. That is the body, feelings, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. And when any of these can be grasped and taken to be a self, and any of these can be the source of delusion, when we apply this naive realist assumption onto the aggregates and not see them or understand them in their own nature, but put a metaphysical weight to them that they really don't merit. I think this particularly plays out with the aggregates of perception and consciousness. And it's, I would say, very useful, very important to understand and unravel that relationship in your own mind, how consciousness and perception work to create a simulation of the world in which we actually live. As the naive realist assumption is that we actually are experiencing the outer universe directly, and that's not at all correct when we look at the process up close in detail. We have vijnana, consciousness, our first opening to the outer world, and we have this limited apertures of the five senses, the five physical senses. And this is all the information we have about an external world. Our signals on a very narrow range. The eye, for example, processes electromagnetic radiation in a very narrow band that we call light. The ears only hear sounds within a certain range of frequencies. And all the senses are like that. They're limited by their physiology. And these signals, this information that comes from the outer world, is all we have to directly experience. So it's like shadows cast on a wall, and you're trying to figure out what casts the shadow. Perception, sanya, is the purely mental quality that takes the data provided from the senses that is experienced immediately by vijnana and recognizes it and makes sense of it. And it's a very important part of the process of how we actually experience anything. Is we contact it through the senses, then we perceive it as the second stage, the mind working up the data. And for most of us, most of the time, perception interprets the data reasonably well enough for us to be able to function in the world. But we can see some simple examples that perception is not a completely reliable picture of the external world. Even beyond the limitations of the senses, we have the problems of the processing of that data by perception. Perception can be fooled. The classic example that comes up in the text is the person walking in the forest in the twilight, and there's a piece of rope on the ground, and he's startled. He thinks it's a snake. People here have sometimes had the experience of seeing a bear. You get closer, it's just a tree stump. The limited amount of information coming in from the senses is then perceived incorrectly. And you can see how fluid perception is with a very simple experiment that everybody has probably done at some point in your life, is lying back on the ground in a relaxed way and looking at the clouds in the sky, and seeing shapes and faces and animals and things in the clouds. And if you're in the right frame of mind, you're very relaxed, then these images can become very detailed. Also, sometimes with like an open fire, you can do that. These kind of things where the raw information is fed to perception, and because of the relaxed state, there's a kind of a feeling that perception is somewhat off its leash. It can play. And perception is doing that. But most of the time it's more businesslike. It's trying to make a accurate representation. You can also see it in dreams at night. When you dream, it's like perception is completely free. It's not bound by the incoming senses. It just works with fragments of memory or imagination and makes stuff up. But it seems to the dreamer, it seems like a very real experience. It's not, it doesn't seem shadowy in any way. And there's no real difference between dreaming and waking, except that in waking there's some constraint on perception by the senses. But we are essentially dreaming the actual world that we live in. The world we actually experience is not the outer universe. That's a moot point. We can never really know it. What we experience is our own representation of it. Now As I said, generally you can trust your perception is going to be a reasonably accurate representation. Unless there's some derangement in the mind, the perception will be accurate enough for all practical purposes. But it's not actually the real phenomena, whatever that might be, whatever that might mean. In the Satipatthana Sutta, the Buddha is giving meditation instruction about mindfulness directed towards the four bases or foundations of mindfulness, which correspond pretty roughly to 4 of the 5 aggregates. And in each case, he says, contemplating the body, for example, let there be just the body. Contemplating feelings, let there be just the feelings. One interpretation of that could be taken to have a broad application is that if we want to have an undiluted, a realistic view of the aggregates and what's happening, we take them in their own nature and their face value. So perception is just a perception. It's not the world. And likewise, mental formation, sankharas. This is another one that can be a cause of trouble if it's held wrongly. The sankharas are mental objects. As the word sankhara means something built up or constructed. So they're ideas, memories, concepts we build up in the mind. And they can be extremely useful. We wouldn't be able to function without sankharas. We need them. It's how we manipulate the information that we have to make decisions and do things. But it becomes problematic if you take them too seriously, if you take them as an intrinsic reality outside of their own domain. This is just a mental formation. And we see this all the time. People go through a lot of suffering unnecessarily, entirely due to their mental formations, their projections and their ideas. Sometimes this impacts on interpersonal relations and can be a cause of misunderstanding, where you project onto another person motives and what did he really mean by that, this type of thing, and you forget it's your own mental formation, your own spinning that you're dealing with. There's a lot of ordinary suffering can be alleviated if you just remember the simple principle not to take your own mental formation so seriously. It can help to have a kind of sense of humor about it, like, oh, here I am thinking about that nonsense again. And not to believe everything that pops into your mind. It's a construction. It might be based on some fragments of reality. It might have some utility, but it might not. It might just, you have to be fluid and flexible with your mental formations. This also applies to a particular class of mental formations we call views or ditthis. That the attachment to views is a very troublesome and pernicious vice. People get into all kinds of personal, interpersonal trouble strictly due to attachment to views. And it comes up that I'm many times quoted these in the talks here, a couple of parables in the Digha Nikaya about attachment to views. And the one of them is the 2 men who are going on a journey and they find some piles of straw. And they say, oh, this will be good. We can take this home. It'll be useful to feed our pigs. And they tie up the straw in the bundles and put it on their heads in Indian fashion and keep walking. And then after a few more kilometers, they come to some piles of cloth, bolts of cloth, and one of them says, "Oh, that's more valuable than straw," and he throws the straw away without a second thought and picks up the cloth. And the other fellow says, "I've been carrying this straw now for a few miles. I think I don't want to abandon it yet." "Well, suit yourself, friend." And as the story goes on, they keep finding more and more valuable items, and the one fellow is always ready to toss aside what he has on his head and pick up the other item. And the second fellow is, the further he goes with that straw, the more attached he is to it. He feels like he's put so much effort into carrying this straw this distance, he's not going to abandon it now. So the one guy comes back to the village with a sack of diamonds and jewels, and the other one comes back with a bundle of straw. And the Buddha explicitly explained that as being a parable for attachment to views. Now, one aspect of that I think can be overlooked is the Buddha didn't praise somebody who came back to the village with an empty head. So he's not saying you shouldn't have views, but you should regard them just as views. It's not an expression of reality. So in their views, let there be just views. This is my view, this is my opinion. If something proves me wrong, then I'll abandon it, and I'll pick up the superior view. And of course, a big delusion is viewing any of the five aggregates as the self. And this is the primary reason the Buddha taught the teaching of the five aggregates, was to see the emptiness of all five. Because any one of the aggregates can be held to as a self in one of four ways, making 20 altogether. Taking the body, for example, you can think I am the body, or the body belongs to me, or I am in the body, or the body is in me. And these identifications can be implicit. You may not even really be fully aware of it, or they may be explicit, and people can develop philosophies and theories, religions around one of these 20 kinds of views. But if you look at any of them, there's no substantial nature to any of it. The Buddha compared some really evocative imagery. He used images for the five aggregates. He said the body is like sea foam, feelings are like soap bubbles, perception is like a mirage in the desert, consciousness is a conjuring trick, and mental formations are like a plantain tree trunk. And that one seems a bit odd, and I never understood it until I went to Thailand and actually saw a plantain tree that had been cut down. The trunk is completely hollow. It's not really a trunk at all. It's almost like big blades of grass that curl around each other, and the inside is just hollow. So all these things are insubstantial and empty, no self-substance, no self-existent nature. They're all conditioned, dependently arisen. One common delusion is to see the rupa kanda, the body in particular, and matter in general, as being something substantial. It's significant that that view of physicality as completely dissolved with the physics of the 20th century. In the 19th century, the understanding of the physical universe was probably the furthest away from the Buddhist view as you could get, this kind of universe of hard little billiard balls. And then they find relativity, and then even more so quantum mechanics, the really insubstantial nature of phenomena that exist only as probabilities. some people identify with consciousness as a self. I think that's another common one, that there's a sense of the I. I think this is equivalent to the pre-Buddhist view in India of the Atman. There's some little thing that is inside of you that is conscious and aware. But when we look at consciousness just as consciousness, we don't find anybody doing it or anything doing it. It's just happening. Part of our difficulty in grasping that is the limitation of language, because we're forced by the nature of language to talk about consciousness with a noun. And that doesn't matter if we're talking in English or in Greek or in Pali. In Pali we call it chitta or vijnana. Those are still nouns. But then when it's defined, chitta is defined as the process of chinteti. It's a verb from a noun from a verb. Vijnana from vinyati, ultimately janati. So there's nouns of convenience, one might say. There's no thing there. There's just a knowing. It doesn't matter how hard you look, you won't find anything that does it, that knows. And it's a little subtle, difficult to understand, not because it's complicated, but because it's so ultimately simple. There's nothing to grasp. It's just the knowing. And we can see this for ourselves in meditation when the mind is clear and focused enough. There's only the object and the knowing of the object. There's no room. It makes no sense to insert a third element of a person doing it. It's just the object and the knowing of the object. So to avoid falling into delusion, try and take the phenomena of reality as given, the aggregates, just on their own, on their own basis. The body is just the body, feelings are just feelings, perception is just perception, and so on. It has no metaphysical or ontological weight beyond that or outside of its own domain. And with the practice, if you practice meditation and you train the mind, you should begin to see things more clearly and be able to have more intuitive understanding of these things and not fall into common traps of delusion. You can see how the mind is unreliable, how it spins things, and you just take it at face value as it is. You don't give any particular importance to it. So I think I'll leave it there. That's enough for this evening.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.